Hey friend, Colin here from Sumthins Recording, and today I'm going to show you how to record snare drum. Today we're going to be exploring recording snare drum using a snare top as well as a snare bottom mic, and this is going to help you get a better snare drum tone right from the source. But before we dive in, if you're looking to start dialing in a repeatable workflow for cranking out professional sounding drum mixes, then you need to go through my 3-step framework for mixing drums workshop. This workshop is going to walk you through the simple 3-step process I go through on almost every single one of my mixes to help you dial in a workflow for starting to create professional sounding drum mixes right from your home studio. It is a 100% free to watch, on-demand video training, and you can get instant access to that by clicking the link below in the video description. Now, let's jump in here and look at recording snare drum. So here we are making our way into the drum room here. This is the kit. You can see we actually have the kick baffled off here. Sometimes when we have a drummer that's not striking the kick drum quite as hard, we'll baffle off the kick drum so we don't get a lot of cymbal bleed, or the opposite way too. If we have a drummer that's just hitting the cymbals too hard, we'll end up baffling the kick drum to try and reduce some of the cymbal bleed into a condenser on the front. But that's not what we're looking at here today. We are looking at our snare drum. So we actually have two mics on our snare drum. If we get in here from the side, we have our top mic, and then underneath we have our bottom mic. So we're going to come around here. We're going to talk about our top mic first. So our top mic on the snare drum is an Audix i5. That's this guy right here. It's a relatively affordable microphone. It's pretty similar to like an SM57. It'll give you that same kind of crack up in the high mids. It's great on guitar cabs as well. The main difference for me between a 57 and the Audix i5 here is that the Audix has a lot more bottom end and weight to it. And I don't mean low bottom end like you could put it on a kick drum. I mean like that 200 hertz, that heat that you want to hear when the drummer's striking the snare drum. So for me, this works so much better on the snare drum than a 57 because I like a beefier snare drum. So I like using the Audix instead of a normal SM57. The 57 gives you a lot of great crack. And if I do end up using a 57, what we used to do is we would have the 57 here, and then we would actually tape a condenser mic to it. So any kind of pencil condenser will work as long as it has an extended frequency range on it. So it'll give you more of that bottom end, and it'll also give you more top end. So if you're not miking your hi-hat or anything, it'll give you plenty of hi-hat to come through on the condenser that you tape to your dynamic mic here. So this is a dynamic mic, very similar to our SM57, just has more weight to it. I like to bring the mic in just over the rim of the snare drum and then point towards the center. So there's a couple different ways you can go about this. If you pull it back and kind of lift a little bit higher and point more towards the center, you'll get more of just that center hit attack and less of the kind of tone from the drum. If you pull in further and point more down towards the rim, you'll get more of this tone from the edge, from the rim of the drum. This is kind of a nice compromise between both, so we're just in over the edge, over the rim here, and then pointing towards the center. So we get some tone and some sound from the rim, but we also get that attack and that nice crack from the stick making contact with the center of the drum. By pointing towards where the drummer is striking, we emphasize that attack, and we get some more energy and emphasis there on the drum, on that actual stick attack. So that's our snare top here. We're kind of going to come around the front of the kit here to look at the snare bottom. So on the bottom here, if we can kind of get in here, that's our snare bottom mic. And I actually used to use another Audix i5 on the bottom. Any kind of dynamic mic is going to work on the bottom here. Again, it'll give you that nice lift around the high mid area, around that 3 or 4 or 5K range, like a 57 will. It just gives you some more weight. But since we've switched to using that on the top, I actually opted for this 545, which is a newer purchase for me, but it has a smoother top end than a 57 or even the Audix mic. And using it on the snare bottom, I wanted something that has a smoother top end. So it's not going to be, really aggressive, and it won't be kind of pokey or brittle sounding. The snare bottom like this, miking the snares, you can see the actual snare wires across the drum. Miking those, you can get more of a brittle sound sometimes if you have something that doesn't have a very smooth or pleasing top end here. This 545 microphone works splendidly on the snare bottom. It has this smoother characteristic on the top end than a 57. It's very 57-like. It has a very similar frequency response. It just takes the top end and the high mid a bit better than a 57 does. So it's not as brittle. Not that a 57 comes off brittle, but it has less chance of becoming brittle or harsh when we put it in with the rest of the drums here. So another dynamic mic here on the bottom, 545. It actually has a nice switch on it too, so you can turn it on and off. Those are our snare top and bottom mics. If we come around the side here, let's see if we can get in looking down the side. So that's our Audix mic pointing towards the center of the drum. You can see how that's aimed there. And then right underneath it, that is our 545. So we can kind of get a view of both of them here pointing in at the center of the drum. So same kind of philosophy with the bottom mic here. I like to point it towards the center of the drum, and this way it's pointing at the actual snares running across the bottom of the drum. It also helps a little bit with phase when we flip the top mic, because they're both pointing at the same spot on the snare drum. So it just helps a little bit with the phase relationship between the two mics. And we'll talk about that more as we get out at the board and inside of the DAW. Now both snare mics, both the top and bottom, are running into this snake white right here, and this runs out from the room into the back of the Studio Live, the board right here, and they're coming up on channels 4 and 6 here. So we have a couple extra things that run into the board. Here's our kick in and kick out. We have an external kick mic that I use for room mics sometimes for miking the kick. Then we have our snare top. This is where we used to put in the condenser mic. So if I do end up using a 57 on the snare drum, this mic 5 slot is usually where I'll put that condenser in. And then here's our snare bottom. So coming around to the front of the board here, show you where each of these mics is coming up. So here is our snare top coming up on number 4. You can see there's no EQ or compression going on, but we do have the phase flipped on the snare top mic. Usually what you'll see is people flipping the snare bottom to be in phase with the snare top. What I actually like to do is flip the snare top. And for me, it's one less move I have to make later. So when I'm checking my snare against my overheads, I don't have to flip my overheads or anything. So instead of flipping the snare bottom and then flipping the entire snare or flipping the overheads to be in phase, I just flip the snare top. So it puts my entire snare in phase with itself as well as in phase with the overhead. So nice tip to make things a little bit easier is just flipping the phase on the snare top there. The preamp gain is at about 10 dB here. Again, it keeps us coming up around the -12 or a little bit under here. It leaves me plenty of headroom, especially with something like snare drum that's very, very transient driven. If he happens to strike the snare drum a little bit harder, it gives me plenty of room that we're not going to clip on the way in here. Coming over, we're going to skip this. You can see snare high. That's where that condenser will usually go in. And then we have snare bottom coming up here. Again, no EQ or compression on the way in. You can see no phase or anything like that, no high pass filter. And preamp gain is pretty much the same, or exactly the same, 10 dB as our snare top mic. And that just, again, leaves us so we're coming up around -12 or a little bit below. So if he does, again, hit the drum harder, we have plenty of headroom on the way in that we're not going to clip. Okie dokie, we are back inside of the DAW here now. As you saw on the way in, I don't like to do EQ and compression on the board and commit it to the audio file, just in case we're working through a session, we're making fast decisions. I don't want anything to go wrong, and I don't want to ruin a good performance by maybe setting a compressor too much or EQing it too much. So I like to run it clean on the way in and then do my EQ and compression on the actual tracks inside the DAW, and then bounce it and commit it here inside the DAW. So let me play you the finished snare drum sound against the raw snare drum sound. So we'll start, here's our raw snare drum sound, so just our snare top and our snare bottom balanced together here, and then I'll click in our EQ and compression, and you can hear the difference it's making. You can hear what we're getting from our EQ and compression on these two tracks. It's a little bit more weight. We're emphasizing that bottom end. We're getting some nice sizzle and some nice crack up on the top end. And we're also using our compressor to emphasize that front end transient to give us more attack on the way in here. Ooh, excuse me, almost lost my voice while I'm talking there. So let's go in and look at the processing on each of these individual tracks here. So here's just our snare top mic, and we'll kind of walk through the processing that we're doing here on the drum. So here's just the snare top by itself, and then I'll kick in our EQ and compression. So you can hear how fat this drum sounds just on the way in, just the raw microphone. That's all that Audix i5. It gives you that nice crack in the high mids, but it really emphasizes that low energy weight that you want to get from a snare drum. It really makes the snare drum feel fat. Now, in terms of EQ and compression, just our EQ here, only 2 moves. So I'm boosting 2 dB at 100 hertz here, just to bring up some of that low end weight, and it kind of brings in some of the kick drum as well. And then when you mix your snare drum in with your kick drum, you get that extra oomph coming from your snare drum mics as well, up towards 100, which is kind of cool. Nothing in the mid-range here. I'm always wary of cutting mid-range on snare drum because a lot of the energy lies in the mid-range on snare drum, and if we start to cut that, it can get very hollow and very narrow sounding. So I never want to cut anything on the mid-range of a snare drum unless I really, really have to. Last move we're making here is I'm boosting 2 clicks or 4 dB at 5K here, and this is bringing out emphasis on that top end sizzle and that top end crack on the snare tops. Take a listen here without our EQ, and then I'll kick it in. So that's our EQ here. Moving on, we have our compressor. Now for snare drum, I really like to reach for an 1176 style compressor. So I'm using the FET comp here from Studio One. We're going 4:1 ratio, 0.55 millisecond attack, if I can see that correctly. I got lights in my face. And then we've got a 50 millisecond release, so fastest release here, and medium slow release for the, or attack for this unit, but still pretty fast. So that means we're gonna grab the snare drum as fast as we can and then let go as fast as we can, because we don't want to hold on to it too long and kind of cut off that back end there. We want to compress it and then let go. So we're going to even out our snare drum, and by keeping it medium slow on this unit on the attack, we're going to help to emphasize that initial transient and bring up the attack on the drum. So take a listen here without and then with the compressor. Only doing about 3 dB reduction on some of these bigger peaks here, and it's just going to fold those in with the rest of the snare drum. And then our output gain, we can dial that up to bring up the quieter hits. We get a more even sounding snare drum, and we also emphasize that front end transient to pick up some more attack. So that's our snare top mic. We'll flip over now. Here is our snare bottom mic. So we'll do the same kind of thing here. Raw sound, and then I'll kick in our EQ and compression. You can hear the difference we're making here. adding a touch more weight in the bottom end, and then bringing up some nice air on this snare bottom, so we really hear that kind of sizzle and that crispness of the snares on the bottom of the drum here. So looking at our EQ first here, same kind of moves, just a little bit different frequencies on the top end. We're still doing a 1-click boost at 100 hertz, so a 2 dB boost at 100 hertz. And here we actually bring up more of the kick drum, and it kind of gives you some of that beater side of the kick drum. Because our snare bottom mic is pointing up towards the snare bottom, it's closer towards where the beater is making contact with the front side of the snare or of the kick drum head. So we bring up some of that energy as well here by boosting 100 hertz, which blends really, really nicely with our kick drum when we put both of these drums together here. Now on the top end, we're doing a 2 clicks boost at 10K. So instead of boosting more down towards 5K or 7K here, with this 545 mic, I can actually boost higher because it's smoother, it's less brittle, less harsh sounding. So we can do a 4 dB boost at 10K to bring up some of that air. So take a listen without the EQ and then with it. All right, moving on to our last piece of the puzzle here, our compressor. Same kind of compressor we're using on the snare top here. I like using this 1176 on snare drum. It feels like it grabs some of those bigger transients better than something like a DBX or a Neve 33609, something like that, because I can dial in the attack to set it where I want it. Same settings, 0.55 millisecond attack, and then fastest release here, 4:1. Just doing that maybe 3 dB reduction here to grab those bigger hits and fold them in with the rest of our snare drum hits here. And then we're emphasizing that front end transient to bring up some more attack here. So here's without and then with it. Just bringing up a little bit of that front end attack, that front end transient, which really goes nicely when you throw it in with our snare top mic. So here's both of them together, and I'll ABR processing on the entire snare drum here. So remember, when we're recording snare drum here, snare top and bottom mic, using both dynamic mics, pointing at the center of the drum to get that nice stick attack, and then here inside the DAW, flipping the phase on the snare top mic to keep our drum in phase together, and then a little bit of EQ and a little bit of compression to even out our drum and emphasize that bottom end and that top end crack. I hope that was helpful for you. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, if you're ready to take your drum mixes to the next level, then you need to go through my 3-step framework for mixing drums workshop. This is a completely free, instant access workshop that you can get access to by clicking the link below in the video description. It's going to help you dial in a repeatable workflow for cranking out professional sounding drum mixes right from your home studio. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.